Letters from the Front. Dr. Newman of Mount Alexander, the 25th of August 1900, writing to his brother in Melbourne from Bethlehem. On the 12th of July 1900, Dr. Newman says, quote, "We have had some very lively times since leaving Lindley. We left at 7 a.m. for Bethlehem in the southeast of the Orange Colony. We expected to meet a good deal of resistance, and indeed we did, for we were 6 days getting here and fought 5 battles. And on the day of which there was no battle, there was a lot of sniping. Shortly after starting, when about 3 miles out of Lindley, we got in touch with the Boers, who were on a kopje about 4 miles away. Shelling began and continued more or less all day. Our men outflanked them and made them retire, but as we reached the kopje, the Boers gave us a very warm time. We were camped for the night at the foot of the kopje, and they were shelling it in great form. The Boers were led by De Wet, and our lot by General Paget. Altogether we had 4,000 men, amongst them being some Imperial Bushmen from South and West Australia. Next morning we were ready at 6 o'clock and moved about half a mile when the shelling began. The Boers made excellent practice with their long-range guns at a range of 7 miles, but fortunately no one was injured. We moved on about 3 miles, and the Boers, having taken up a position on some kopjes to the east, our infantry advanced about noon to outflank them, and a great battle followed. We advanced with the infantry until a shell dropped right in front of our ambulance, so we had to retire a little with the hospital. It is impossible to keep out of the range of shells when you come to dealing with guns with so long a range. For instance, we had with us 2 6-inch guns and a range of 10,000 yards. Yet with all this long range, it is surprising so little damage is done by the shells. So far, out of 5 days fighting, we have only one case, that of an Australian bushman struck in the left knee. Unfortunately for him, it drove a piece of clothing into the joint. Since the injury, I've operated on him twice, but I am afraid it will end up in him having a stiff joint. Whilst we were trying to outflank the enemy, Clement's column, which was a few miles to the south of us, was shelling them. By about 2 p.m, when our infantry came within rifle range, there was a great fusillade of small arms, which was kept up until dark. During the afternoon it came on to rain in torrents and was bitterly cold. Our ambulances were sent for, and my commander and I went out to see where the wounded were. We found the bearer company had put them in a deserted farm, and here we were going to at it for a long time dressing them. There were 11 wounded, 1 since dead, and 2 killed. During the night our ambulance had to go out in search of more, whom they had stored at another farm. To make a long story short, it ended by the Boers vacating their position, and our casualties amounted to 20. That night we slept at the farm, and next day removed all the wounded to another farm and left them in charge of a doctor and moved up with the column. During the advance no one is waited for, so we are to make an impromptu hospital for the wounded. Of course some men were missing, and God only knows what becomes of them, but in war no one is waited for, and it is a case of the devil take the hindmost. This day, Wednesday the 4th of July, was comparatively uneventful, only a little shelling and sniping going on. I went over the Boer position of the day before, but could get no idea of their casualties. By the way, our men, Australians, did well in the fight on Tuesday. One of our guns was within an ace of being taken, and it is said that only for the Bushmen it would have been. Next day, Thursday, we were up early. It was bitterly cold and frosty, and as soon as the sun was up, I went up on the kopje and got a good view of the country and could see Clement's column advancing about 7 miles on our right flank. After going about 6 miles, we outspanned and again went on for another 4 miles to Bethlehem, where we camped for the night. Several of our cavalry actually got into the town, but paid for it, several being wounded and 1 killed. There was really no necessity for them to go in, but some men, especially the yeomen, are very foolhardy and do the most ridiculous and dangerous things. Well, this day we had 4 wounded and 1 killed. The shelling was going on all day and a little sniping. Next day we had a very long day. The Boers started shelling our left flank at 7 a.m. and made excellent practice, the shells bursting a few hundred yards to the left of our tents, and shifted some of the infantry camped there. At 9 a.m. we sent in a flag of truce demanding surrender of the town, which the Boers refused to do, so the shelling went on again. Our force brought 2 great 6-inch guns into position, and the rest of the day was pretty lively. These guns are tremendous things, about 15 foot long and drawn by oxen. During the afternoon, the Munster Fusiliers, supported by mounted infantry, attacked their left flank and fell in pretty heavily, having 2 killed and about 40 wounded, some of which have since died. The Boers took up a very strong position in Adonga, and when the Munsters were crossing a mealie field, the Boers opened heavy fire on them, which our men returned for about 2 or 3 hours. The fusillade was tremendous. Finally, the Munsters charged the position and took it. Most of the wounded men say they never saw the Boers, were certainly adept at taking shelter, and baffled our troops considerably. That night we had plenty to do. We had to shift our hospital in the afternoon, and unfortunately night set in before we were settled, and we were wandering about on the veldt until 11 p.m. before we got in all the wounded, and after seeing them and getting something to eat we turned in at 1 a.m. As our hospital was in the firing line, we had to shift at daybreak about a mile back. This day, Saturday, was another busy day as we were operating and dressing cases all day. The guns, big and small, began to sing at daylight. Our 2 columns, the left under Paget and the right under Clements, were both hard at it. I don't know how many guns were engaged, but between them there was a constant din. The boom, pom of the big guns and the click, bang of the small ones kept things lively until noon, when it ceased. Clements' brigade suffered most, and again, as yesterday, the Irish regiment bore the brunt of the action and succeeded in taking a Boer gun and turning them out of their position, but not without the loss of 60 killed and wounded. Clements' men succeeded in getting into Bethlehem and planted their wounded in the local school. On Sunday we shifted our cases into the town, turning the town hall into a hospital, and as usual commandeering all the beds, blankets, mattresses and utensils we could lay our hands on. The town is rather pretty, the principal building, as usual in Dutch towns, being the church. The houses are all empty, the people having cleared out and left their places in great disorder, and needless to say the disorder was considerably increased when Thomas Atkins got in. We commandeered a small house in which we were living and messing at present. It is a great treat after the hard work and irregular hours of last week's fighting. We are very busy at our professional work. Men are wounded all over the place, and I have had some marvellous recoveries. For instance, one man got shot through the body from back to front, the bullet going through the right kidney, liver and bowel. He got peritonitis and was very dicky for some days, but now I believe is going to get well. We left him in a farm some way out, and I went out the other day to see him. We have many other interesting cases. Clements' column left next day for Senegal for supplies, and today Hunter's column arrived about 12,000 strong, among being some Australians, with Colonel Gordon among them in charge. By all appearances there will be a move shortly to capture De Wet, and as Steyn is with him it will be a great coup if it comes off. No doubt you people often wonder at the delays in the transport, and at the present time men are on short rations. It is impossible to move until supplies come in. My health is A1, but of course I could not expect to get fat on active service, although my weight has still kept up. Once De Wet is taken, the climax will probably follow, as it is reported Botha is willing to give in once De Wet is taken. P.S. Yesterday the yeomen fell in again while out repairing the telegraph line between here and Senegal. About 50 of them attacked some Boers on a copy. Result, 3 killed, 4 prisoners, 4 wounded. They could have got away, but as usual were plucky, but foolhardy as a dozen men could hold a copy against 100. So I'm here in Talbot, which is an old gold mining town over in the Western Districts, and I've come to see this monument, which is quite magnificent. Seems to be built in black onyx marble, if that's the word. erected by his friends in memory of Captain Robert Westrop Salmon, VMR, Victorian Mounted Rifles, 1st Victorian Contingent Staff Australian Regiment, who died on service at Navapurt. Out in the kitchen today. I wanted to talk a little bit about the adventure to Talbot I took during the week. You're going to see some of the footage of me at the memorial to Captain Salmon. I had arrived without knowing anything about who the memorial was dedicated to, and there was a bit of adventure involved. So basically, and you'll see some of it, but I didn't capture it all on film. So here's kind of what happened. So I get to Talbot, I find the memorial to Captain Salmon. It's down in a little park. Talbot's a beautiful little place, looks like it's straight out of the gold rush. The buildings, there was hardly anybody around, no cars. And so I found the memorial, and I filmed a little bit, talked a little bit about it. And then I saw the Australian Natives Association Hall opposite the little park I was in, and I wanted to get in there to see the Boer War, a plaque to a different soldier, a G. Hull, I think his name was, in the hall. So I went to the hall, it was locked. I looked next door, the door was open, there was a woman in there. I asked her about the hall, she didn't know what I was talking about. I went to the post office, there was a phone number on the hall about booking stalls at the market, but I couldn't get any phone reception. So I went to the post office. They didn't know what I was talking about. They didn't know what a Boer was, and she didn't know who might have the key. So I went down to the museum, which I had noticed was open as I drove into town, and a little woman called Sally, more than helpful. She wanted me to help her with one of the computers while I was there. Of course, I told her that I ran my own YouTube channel on the Boer War. Eventually she understood what I was asking, so she took me to the hall to see what we could do about getting in. But when we got there, it was already open. There was an elders group doing some sort of exercise routine in the hall, so Sally wasn't needed. But while I was at the museum, Sally showed me this. Talbot's Boer War Monument. And reasonably priced at $5, so I had no hesitation in buying it. Now I want to read you a little bit about who Captain Salmon was and why this memorial is so, it's a big one, it's a special one. It was unveiled by none other than Sir Edmund Barton, the very first Prime Minister of Australia. Salmon, I'm going to read it out to you, but what I've just perused was Captain Salmon had a brother that was in the government, so he was known to Barton through the brother. Captain Salmon's twin was in Talbot as a counsellor. He was one of the first to enlist and go over, and with all the dangers of Boer Mauser bullets and ambushes and battles and cannon fire and shrapnel and pom-poms and all sort of thing. The poor fellow died because of a fly. I'm going to give you the figures as well, but as many men died of fevers and dysentery as did by Boer bullets. So here's a bit of an introduction about Robert Salmon. Robert was a twin brother to Philip Salmon, the town clerk of Talbot, and a brother to Dr. Charles Carty Salmon, MLA, Minister for Education and Commissioner for Trades and Customs. When news was received of Robert's death, a committee was formed, collectors appointed, and the monument was duly erected in front of the Talbot post office. Now, I should have looked in front of the post office for signs that the memorial had been there. I didn't realise at the time that it had been shifted down to the little park I found it in. The monument was supplied by Messrs. Chambers and a Clutter of Melbourne. It has a bluestone block base topped with 2-metre high obelisk of polished granite. The unveiling ceremony, as reported in the Talbot Leader of February the 22nd, 1901, was performed by the first Prime Minister of Australia, Edmund Barton, who spoke in glowing terms of Captain Salmon and his dedication to his duty as a soldier of the Queen. Over the years, the monument has been vandalised at least 3 times. The last occurred on February the 25th, 1995. By that time, the post office was privately owned, and the owners decided they did not want the worry of further trouble. So after 94 years in its original spot, the monument has been restored and moved to the Memorial Park in Talbot, where it's part of the display of memorial to other servicemen from other wars. There is also a memorial tablet for Captain Salmon in St Michael's Church of England in Talbot. And I didn't know that, or I would have tried to get to the church, but unlikely to be anyone there. The monument is significant to the heritage of Talbot as a record of a prominent pioneer family of the area and the respect the Salmon family enjoyed. So I just wanted to read you the day of the memorial unveiling. Soon after the news of the death in South Africa of Captain Robert Salmon, K Company Mounted Rifles, brother of Dr. C.C. Salmon, member of Legislative Assembly for Talbot and Avoca, and Mr. P.W. Salmon, Town Clerk of Talbot, was received, the idea of in some way perpetuating his memory was mooted by Mr. Davies, then the Mayor. Committee was formed, collectors appointed. The late Captain Salmon was a member of the 1st Victorian contingent for the Transvaal, being one of the foremost to volunteer, and sailed in October 1899. Various writers spoke of Captain Salmon in high terms as the war progressed, and his many friends were looking forward to a brilliant career for him when the news arrived that he had died of enteric fever at Navaport. The ceremony of unveiling the monument was performed by the Honourable E. Barton, Prime Minister of Australia, on Friday last. A platform had been erected for the speakers, and on this was seated, besides Mr. Barton. When all were seated, the Mayor came forward and introduced Mr. H. Davies, Chairman of the Memorial Committee. Mr. Davies shortly addressed the assemblage on reference to the occasion of the gathering, remarking that when the news of Captain Salmon's death reached Talbot, it sent a thrill of grief through the district. It had been decided in some way to commemorate the patriotism which had caused him to proceed to the war, and the handsome monument for them was the result. He would introduce the Right Honourable Edmund Barton, Prime Minister of Federated Australia. On Mr. Barton stepping forward, he was received with cheers. Huzzah! Huzzah! As the cord pulling the flag which draped the monument was pulled and the flag fell, the Mounted Rifles presented arms while the bugle sounded forth the last post. Mr. Barton said he had been asked by his friend Dr. Carty Salmon, the MLA, to perform a sad office in testimony of their love for his brother, who lost his life in South Africa, and their veneration for his memory, and it was with extreme pleasure he was present. Captain Salmon had ended his career at a comparatively early age, having fallen by disease. I think he was about 36, which was even a greater enemy than the bullets of the Boers. He lost his life in doing his duty and was worthy to be commemorated as those who fell in action. He went away from home to represent Australia as part of the Empire and laid down his life in discharge of that duty. He was a worthy representative of Australia. For those who knew him in active service on the field of battle had been loud in their praises of him. He was an officer who gained in the performance of his duty nothing but praise from those who observed his doings, whether they stood above him or below him in the scale of rank. Amongst other testimony, the London Times of February the 12th, 1900 said, Captain Salmon of the Victorian Mounted Rifles, who was in his first action, showed exceptional skill in the handling of his men and won much commendation. Hi gang.
Hello.
How are you?
Well, thank you. You're having a bit of a sticky nose?
I'm just a tourist coming through, and I'm looking for one of these plaques for a relative, G. Hull, that went to the Boer War.
So, does anyone here around?
It says on the monument's war site. Oh, there he is, George Hull.
There you go. Oh, big fun.
Magnificent.
Have you been to the museum?
Yes, I have. Yes. So this is to the glory of God and sacred to the memory of Trooper George Hull, son of Mr. George Hull of Danuk, who died whilst on active service in South Africa the 6th of January 1901. Fight the good fight. That's magnificent, isn't it, folks? Wow. So glad we got to see this today. Right, the folks are keeping fit in Talbot. They're doing the right thing, so we'll sashay on out of here.